お待たせいたしました。続きまして、
Thank you for waiting. Accepting the collapse and from Silicon Valley to Asia, or embracing this disruption from Silicon Valley to Asia is the title. And we have as a guest speaker Ernestine Fu, venture partner of Alsop Louie Partners. We have as an interviewer partner of Highland Capital, Peter Bell. Please. また
yesterday on the panel on the startups, but this has been a great 2 days here in Tokyo, talking about what's happening in terms of new economy, new technology, and growth. And it's really an honor to be here with my friend from Silicon Valley, Ernestine Fu. So it's a real honor to be with you. We're going to talk a little about disruption, which is a big buzzword, but I think it's actually really important because it's really around growth and innovation and globalization and things that really tie into some of the themes over the last couple of days here at the New Economy Summit. So maybe just starting off, Ernestine, as you know, when you look at what's happening here in Japan and in Asia and even in Silicon Valley, it's around kind of what's happening, what's the next thing. And I think what's really interesting about Ernestine is you really started to get involved in technology at a young age. So maybe tell us a little about your background and how you got interested in technology.
Okay, sure thing. So, Peter, as you know, I did my undergrad, master's, and started a PhD at Stanford, and Stanford has very close connections with Silicon Valley in general. So that's actually how I first became immersed in the entrepreneurship and the Silicon Valley scene. So started working at a venture capital firm called Alsop Louie Partners when I was in college, and was fortunate enough to close a couple of deals through that firm so that once I graduated, I joined full-time and continued to lead deals and take board seats in various companies. And then since then, I've actually been involved in a couple initiatives in Asia, one of them being advising DBS Bank on venture debt and some of their entrepreneurship programs. Had the opportunity to co-author a book that was translated into Chinese, so was exposed to the Chinese entrepreneurship scene, and then more recently joined the board of directors of a new Rakuten initiative, which will be announced soon. So,
great. As a venture capitalist, it's great because you really spend time with amazing people who are changing the world. But often it's people who have been doing it. Maybe they're 20 years into their career. What's amazing about Ernestine is as she was profiled in Forbes magazine when she was an undergraduate at Stanford. So talk a little about how did you make an impact at such a young age, Ernestine?
So I think actually the number one thing is great mentors. So I had a fantastic set of mentors and supporters early on. The Forbes thing was pretty unusual in terms of I started working at this venture capital firm, and then I closed my first deal, which was in a Stanford PhD startup, and startup led by Stanford PhD founders. And I guess kind of like the hurdles in venture capital include 1, getting into a VC firm, and then 2, closing a deal, and then 3, joining the board and continuing to grow the company through that. So Forbes called me up and was asking, you're in your 20s, how did you manage to close this deal? And then that's how ended up landing on the cover of Forbes.
Right.
So.
That's great. And I know you're doing a lot of interesting things in the United States, but you're also doing a lot in Asia. You're spending a lot of time here. I know whenever Ernestine reaches out to me, she's often traveling here in Asia. So what are you working on here? And what's exciting to you?
So I think I'm actually very excited by the entrepreneurship scene in Asia. I think it's completely different from what's happening in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of disruptive innovation happening, particularly around the messaging space, HTML5, which I can dive into later. But I think the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Asia is definitely different. So that's kind of why I'm excited to explore it here.
Yeah. And I know in your, I was honored last year, Ernestine asked me to be a guest at her class at Stanford. And it's really around venture capital and entrepreneurship. So talk a little about Stanford University and Stanford's sort of role, not just in Silicon Valley, but Stanford's unique, I think, role in sort of creating new companies and innovation.
So the history behind Stanford and Silicon Valley is actually very unique in that there was a dean of the engineering school at Stanford many years ago named Frederick Terman, who actually ended up having 2 master's students who created one of the first large technology companies in Silicon Valley, and that was Hewlett and Packard, and they created HP. And since then, Stanford's spun out a number of interesting companies ranging from Google to Genentech, Nike, and there's a very close connection between the university and Silicon Valley, and essentially entrepreneurs come out of Stanford. Entrepreneurs who do come out of Stanford end up going back to the university and mentoring current students. So there's a unique history between the two.
Yeah. Well, some of the companies you mentioned, Ernestine, they're global brands today. And maybe talk a little about, as you work with entrepreneurs, whether it's in Asia or in the United States, and thinking about being global, and as an investor around cross-border and sort of cross-border financing, and how do you think about, as an investor and an entrepreneur, around sort of the whole idea of globalization, and when is the right time to either pick an investor who's thinking about globalization, or when's the right time as an entrepreneur to think about globalization?
The great news today is that every single company started is essentially an international and a global company. If you publish an app, you can easily, once you hit publish, it goes up over to 160 plus countries in different markets. I think the really interesting thing and we're seeing a lot of a rise in cross-border financing within the US in Silicon Valley companies. And I think the really interesting aspect of that is that there's a rise of what we call like the giant tech companies that we originally saw in Silicon Valley, and we see that all over Asia, all over the world today. And I have a couple of characteristics I would define these kind of large tech companies, and it's one, you see a lot of the original founders and the original management still running the companies today. 2, you actually see a lot of them are very active in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, regionally and globally. And 3, a lot of them are investing in startup companies. So just to give a couple examples of those just within Asia, Rakuten's obviously a clear example. In China, you see Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and I think that's really been important in terms of cross-border financing and kind of bridging different regions in the world.
Right. And maybe talk a little about, as you think about the next big opportunities here in Asia, and the biggest, kind of new technology shifts and disruption. Because a lot, we talk about what's happening in consumer commerce and mobile cloud computing, but you're actually investing in some really interesting things around HTML5, around autonomous vehicles, 3D printing. Talk about some of the technologies and the sectors that you're most excited about.
So I'm really interested in what I consider disruptive technology, so technologies that create new markets, which otherwise, if they did not exist, those markets would not have existed. So one sector I'm really interested in is 3D printing. So the idea that 3D printing is going to basically change the way we live completely in a manufacturing sense. It's going to affect the medical sector as we're able to 3D print different parts of our bodies. It's going to impact the military sector when we can actually print weapons. It's going to impact food when we can 3D print food. So that's one sector I'm very interested in on both the hardware and the software side. Another sector is autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. That's actually what I started my PhD research on, and I think that's going to completely change how we think about transportation. Currently, there's kind of this challenge on the regulatory side in terms of when it's actually going to roll out. And I think long-term self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles, every single car on the road is going to be like that we're going to completely eliminate the need for traffic lights because autonomous vehicles are going to maximize efficiency. We're not going to need parking spaces. Actually, most of urban landscape consists of parking spaces, so we're going to completely eliminate that. And there's going to be this idea of shared car ownership because these self-driving cars are just going to be operating on the roads. In terms of like other technologies I'm interested in, I think one thing that Asia has done really well is around HTML5 and this idea of this app within app model. So I think one of the most innovative companies is actually WeChat in China. So if you look a number of years ago, both WeChat and Facebook were looking towards HTML5 and thinking about building kind of an app within app, so an app that has services like payments, games, being able to call Uber, transportation, and Facebook actually tried very hard at that technology, but ended up not succeeding and then shifting towards more of an advertising model. So if you look at where Facebook gets all of its revenue, it's primarily from selling ads to basically download apps in the App Store, Apple or Android. And then if you look at what WeChat has done, they succeeded at that. And if you look at WeChat as a messenger platform, it's not just messaging between, say, like you and me, Peter, but also being able to pay for a taxi, play games within the app. And I think that's one thing that I'm very excited about, which is just this idea of HTML5 and being able to integrate that. I actually think that JavaScript engineers are probably going to be the most valued engineers in Asia and globally as H5 becomes widespread.
Yeah, well, those are some exciting sectors. And talk a little about Ernestine. You work and you mentor a lot of very smart young people, and there's many entrepreneurs in the audience. But as you mentor people who are thinking about starting companies, what's sort of the guidance you give them? Because it's so difficult to actually get a company started. What do you advise them, and how do you sort of coach them or mentor them as they're thinking about starting companies?
I think the number one thing is finding and pursuing something that you're passionate about. So it's not just about pursuing, say, like a social app company because that's popular, or like an O2O startup because that's popular. Now, like VR is really popular, but really figuring out like what's the sector that you're really interested in and being able to see the vision for that sector as opposed to simply just following the trends and what's popular.
And what do you see as sort of the maybe unique challenges here in Japan and in Asia that maybe are different than you see in Silicon Valley in terms of getting companies started?
I think one of the challenges is probably cultural mindset, which I see is actually changing and shifting both in Japan and Asia globally, which is this idea that don't be afraid to take a risk, don't be afraid to fail. I think that's a common mantra within Silicon Valley. Being able to fail at a startup is seen as kind of a badge of honor. And I think that's starting to change globally as well. And I think another thing that's actually really unique is this idea of a millennial generation. If you look in Japan and specifically the colleges, for the first time ever, every single student is using the same apps and the same technology and the same iPhones as everyone else globally. And I think the millennial generation is really going to drive startups and early stage companies because they really understand these consumer products. And
Right.
we're seeing that for the first time ever.
Right. And as you think about the opportunities here in Japan and in Asia, talk a little about the role of government in terms of fostering innovation and having the right balance there. What are some of the things that you think are going to be important to creating this new economy here in Japan?
I think government support is definitely extremely important. I would extend it towards not just government support, but also support by large companies and corporations here. I think Rakuten's done an excellent job with that with this entire New Economy Summit. But I think this idea of having entrepreneurship programs within middle schools and high schools and providing that early education and providing that support is really important. Two, it's also just funding support to drive the ecosystem, whether that's supporting early stage funds or early stage entrepreneurs. And I think those two key things would be really important.
Right, right. And are there any opportunities you think of the sectors that you're involved in and you're passionate about that you think are really the next, real global business? I think of companies of consequence. What are the companies of consequence or the businesses that can be built here in Japan and in Asia that you are most interested in?
So I'm really interested in platform companies. So I think there's a huge opportunity to build large platform companies, messengers being one example, which I alluded to earlier, but basically the idea that companies that can address every single sector and actually serve as a platform, whether that's in transportation to food to e-commerce, and really target large consumer markets that way.
Right, right. And it's as I kind of started our session and talking about the disruption, which is a buzzword, but I think what's really amazing is what young people are doing today, both here in Japan and around the world. And how would you kind of coach, younger people in our audience, younger people here in Japan? How much experience do you need before you embark on your own journey?
I think absolutely no experience at all. I had no experience in venture capital when I started out, but I think it's just being open to learning about that. So no experience required. Don't be afraid to fail, and just go for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, the way when I, as I mentioned earlier, I saw when I read about Ernestine, I guess it was 5 years ago, in Forbes magazine in the United States, around, I think at the time, the youngest person in venture capital, really inspired me, and that's how we initially met. And I think what really impacted me in our first meeting, I remember in our office in Palo Alto, was sort of your curiosity for what can happen. And I guess maybe as we kind of end our session before lunch, is what's the message you would leave with the entrepreneurs in our audience today here at the New Economy Summit in terms of your curiosity and how to share that with them?
I would say figure out what you're passionate about, find the right mentors to support you in that, and just always be open and curious.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ernestine, and thank you all for your time this morning. It was great to chat with you, and I look forward to all the big things you're continuing to do in your life. Thank you very much. Thank you.